Hello. On April 21st, 1865, a train rolled slowly out of the station in Washington, D.C., bearing the body of Abraham Lincoln on what would become a 3-week, 1,600-mile journey to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. In Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Buffalo, the coffin would be taken off the train, placed on a horse-drawn hearse, and carried through the city. As hundreds of thousands of people, black and white, followed slowly behind. In 400 towns and villages, the train stopped, or at least slowed down, giving millions of Americans a chance to say their goodbyes and reflect. As the train passed through the countryside, farmers would stand still in their fields, sometimes even kneel. And at night, clusters of people could be seen holding torches as the train rolled by. Lincoln's funeral train was taking the very same route that he had taken 4 years before in coming from Springfield to Washington to become inaugurated as the 16th president. And on this return trip, it was very clear that the landscape of this country had changed. Not so much the outer landscape, but I would say the inner landscape of the American people. The hearts and minds of people as they came to reflect on what Lincoln had meant when he had spoken about a new birth of freedom. Today we will be considering what lay at the heart of that change, that is to say, the ending of slavery, and how it happened in those 4 years between 1861 and 1865. And particularly, we will look through the lens of two human beings, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, whose lives became intertwined in such a fascinating way in the last several years of the war. But we will also look at these events in the context of what happened in the decades at the core of the 19th century, those 4 decades from 1840 to 1880. Not only the outer events that washed from one side of the globe to the other and which still really send ripples on into our modern times, but also, as Rudolf Steiner asks us to do, to consider the events that took place in the heavens above in the years leading up to the autumn of 1879. But on that we will speak more in a moment. But let us begin in the year 1841. The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society is having its annual meeting, and they've chosen for the occasion a great shipbuilders' hall on the island of Nantucket. And it was literally filled to the rafters. There were people up high looking down. The first speaker was Wendell Phillips, the golden trumpet of abolition. And after a few more speakers, one man turned to a young man next to him and said, I think you should speak. I think no one knows slavery the way that you do. And so finally, this young man plucked up enough courage to get up, walk up onto the stage, and as he looked out, he said, I was trembling in every limb. I felt I could hardly put a sentence together without hesitation, without stammering. And yet, as he spoke, people came to an absolute rapt attention. My name, he said, is Frederick Douglass. I am 23 years old. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland. And as being born a slave, there was no record of my birth. But I remember that my mother, who lived several miles away, would come in the middle of the night, sneak into my bedside, and then she would say the words to me, "My little Valentine." And so I have taken my birthday as February 14th. Now, I grew up in the household of Mr. Thomas Auld, and I was from an early age a house slave, looking after the little children. And then came the day when I was about 12 that Mrs. Auld pulled the children together, and while I stood behind in the couch, she began to tell them and show them books to teach them how to read. And after an hour or two of this, she notices with some amusement that I was looking over her shoulder and was actually obviously catching on a little bit to the mystery of those marks on the page. I was learning to read. And in fact, in a few days, I made such progress that when Mr. Auld came home from a business trip, she told him, only for him to break out into a rage. Don't you know that reading ruins a slave? And in fact, it's illegal to teach a slave how to read or write. But it was too late. When I would go off on errands for the family, I would see some schoolboys sitting there, cracking open their books, I'd sit next to them and ask for a little bit of help. And whenever I could get a few pennies together, I would go in the back door of a bookstore, come out with a little book which I would hold tightly to myself, keeping it in hiding until there was a moment when I could sit down and read. And so the blinders fell off. And you know, for a slave, what the blinders are, it is to be in the eternal present, in only this place, this time. When you begin to read, the blinders fall off and the horizons start to expand. Time stretches out. There's not only a past, but you dream of a future. And there are distant places to consider and events that have happened. And of all the books that I got my hands on, the one that was most important to me was the Columbian Orator. Well, for Frederick Douglass, what a wonderful thing, because it had speeches from Cicero, from George Washington, a book filled with eloquence, the elegance of the written language. And from that point on, Frederick Douglass began to dream bigger dreams. Well, he was sent off to be a field hand off on the Eastern Shore. And he said, I just could not tame my restless mind. And it wasn't too long before he was considered to be a troublesome slave. So he was sent off to live with Edward Covey, a well-known slave breaker. And thus began the most miserable months of his life. He was aching from the work, and every week there'd be some excuse for Mr. Covey to take him and drag him off to a tree, tie him up, and give him a whipping. And this went on for week after miserable week. On the Sabbath, he would walk over to the Chesapeake Bay, and there he would see ships under sail, and he would imagine what ports they have come from and what ports they are going to. He later wrote of his thoughts from those days. You are loosed from your moorings and are free, and I am fast in my chains. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's swift-winged angels that fly around the world. I am confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free. Well, week after week this went on. He told them that he felt like he was being ground down to be simply a brute. One day, when he was leading a horse out of the stables, he felt the arms of Mr. Covey around him, throwing him down, dragging him off to a tree. And he began to do the unthinkable and fight back. Whence came this daring spirit, he said, to fight against a man whom just 48 hours before, his very glance would cause me to tremble like a leaf in a storm? I do not know. But I was resolved to fight, and I was hard at it. Up they went, down they went onto the ground, one on top, then the other on top. Mr. Covey called out to his other slaves and said, "Come and take him off of me." But they just went about their own business. And on it went for a good part of an hour until, full exhaustion, they stumbled away from each other, and Mr. Covey walked away muttering threats. And yet, he never whipped Frederick Douglass again. Eventually, he was sent off to other farms. This was clearly not the life for him, so they finally sent him back to Mr. Auld, who said, "Well, I can hire him out to a shipyard, and he can bring back his earnings to me." And that began his life as an apprentice, as ship's caulker. Now, it wasn't long on his trips over to the shipyards before he ran into a young freedwoman named Anna Murray. And they fell in love, and together they began to plot his escape. Anna Murray got all her money together she could, bought a sailor's uniform, got some papers from a sailor that he could use, except that the description was nothing like him. And he put on the uniform, went to a ferry, crossed over to the eastern shore, went up through Delaware on train. A couple times he said he recognized someone, and luckily they didn't look back towards him. He made it to Philadelphia, then on to New York, then to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And joining him was Anna Murray. And that was the story that he told them on that day in 1841 on Nantucket Island. Now, when he sat down, there was total silence in the room until the man sitting next to him, William Lloyd Garrison, stood up. Well, he proceeded to give a rousing speech, raising one point after the other of slaveholders, and then, like a great tornado, thrusting it down. When he was finished, he pointed to Frederick Douglass and he said, "Is this a thing, a chattel person, or a man? Should such a man as he be held captive in a Christian land?" And there was a great roar, "No." Well, the audience was so taken by Frederick Douglass that they gathered the money together that was necessary that he could leave his work as a ship's caulker in New Bedford and go off onto the trail of an abolitionist. And that's what he did. For the next 20 years, he gave speeches and he wrote, and his autobiography appeared 4 years later. And that was Frederick Douglass. But I would like to move ahead in time from 1841. I'd like to move 38 years ahead to 1879, and then another 38 years to 1917, and consider some very interesting things that Rudolf Steiner had to say during those months. Now, for 8 months of that year, from February through September of 1917, Rudolf Steiner had stayed in his Motzstrasse apartment, except for from tours. 8 long months, from February right through September. And in the very darkest times of the war, the cold and the famine that struck German and Austrian lands, he didn't take any more rations than anyone else did. It was a very difficult winter, but he wanted to be in the middle of the very, very important actions that were taking place around him in Berlin. But that's a story for another time. But by Michaelmas, he was back in Dornach and began the first of the lectures that we come to know of as the spiritual background of the external world. You can picture people putting down their hammers and chisels and the Gurdianum and coming across to the woodworking room and sitting and listening as he began. Now, on that Michaelmas evening, you can just think of what it was for them to come out of the German lands and into Switzerland telling them, the present time is literally challenging us every hour, indeed every minute, to wake up. Anthroposophy as a science of the spirit can only be understood by those who are able to grasp that humanity is being asked to make a great decision. Either the spirit is understood or the chaos continues. Now, 2 weeks later, it was a Sunday evening on October 14th, he spoke, as far as I know, for the first time of an event that took place 38 years before then, in autumn of 1879. In the autumn of that year, he said, a struggle that had been going on for decades culminated in the victory of Michael over the spirits of darkness. Now, over the next several lectures, he spoke about the significance of that particular event. I want to take one part of it only. And I want to mention that he said about a profound change that occurred in humanity. He said, up until that time, the good forces of goodness, the spirits of light, had actually worked to keep humanity very tightly bound to heredity, to the ties of blood. That while Lucifer was pushing in earlier millennia that humanity should become free, but a freedom that was premature, that it was the spirits of light that were giving, as it were, a kind of weight to the human being through these forces of heredity that would help human beings find their way more strongly to the earth. And yet, after these events leading up to 1879 and then after 1879, the roles have been reversed. From this point on, Michael and the spirits of light work to bring spiritual independence to the human being, the possibility of free initiative, the possibility of an impulse to freedom. And what of those bonds of heredity and those bonds of blood? Well, you see the forces of darkness now having taken over the role of furthering them. And clearly in World War I, you have to have an example of where these kinds of bonds of nation and blood and tribe were trying to maintain their foothold in the world. But Rudolf Steiner said something very interesting as well. He said, in fact, what happened in autumn of 1879 was a culmination of a battle in the heavens that had been going on for 38 years, taking us back to 1841. And that it was important to look for significant events during those very decades that can take us more deeply in what was happening in humanity, with the human spirit, while what was so important was happening in the world above. And few deeds, it seems to me, can be seen to be more symptomatic, more significant than what was happening during those years in the battle over slavery. I mean, what could be seen as a stronger example of the ties of blood and tribe than the enslavement of 4 million people held in bondage to others purely based on the color of their skin. And so let us go back now to Frederick Douglass. Now, from 1841 on, Frederick Douglass threw himself into the cause of abolitionism. And 2 decades later, when the war began, 1861, he threw himself with every fiber of his being into the cause of using this war to end slavery. And yet, at the time, it seemed like a very unlikely possibility, even to most abolitionists. After all, slavery had been entrenched in this country for 240 years. Millions of people held in bondage to others. It was widely accepted across the North. Many in the North, such as in southern Illinois or Indiana or Ohio, were afraid of what might happen if millions of former slaves would find their way to the North. And Illinois' legislature actually forbade any newly freed blacks from entering the state. And yet, despite the fact that it was accepted or at least tolerated by the vast majority of people in the North right into the war, right into the first years of the war, it did end in just those 4 years. And that is truly a remarkable story. And to understand it, we have to look at people such as Frederick Douglass, who played a role, but then, of course, also to Abraham Lincoln. And I'd like to consider a bit of his story. You all know it, and if you want to be refreshed, there are 15,000 biographies of Abraham Lincoln. We're going to start in the year when he was 21 years old. He has newly come to Illinois with his family. He helps his father get the farm started, and then he announces his independence, not only from his father, but from the hard work of the farm, the chopping and the fence building and the plowing and the endless backbreaking tasks of the farm. He wanted a different life. So he and a few friends slapped together some boards, turned it into a flatboat, and set off on the adventure of heading down to New Orleans. They packed some produce aboard to sell and then headed down the Sangamon River. The very first afternoon they came around a bend, were passing a little town of New Salem, when the flatboat ran headlong into a mill dam and began to tilt upwards, and the produce began to slide off. Abraham Lincoln, dressed in his plaid shirt and his red scarf, this tall, gangly man, hops off and takes a couple of barrels of pork and puts it on the side, then runs into town, grabs a drill, comes back, drills holes in the front of the boat to allow the water to drain out. It then tips back, and it goes over the dam. That night, they had a rousing good time with the people of New Salem and then headed off to New Orleans. But a year later, he came back and he took a position there as clerk in the general store. And I often think, what a perfect job for a young man, 22-year-old man. Lincoln had grown up with stories. He'd always gone Indiana to the general store whenever he could, and he would just imbibe these stories from the frontier and go back and try them out on his friends. Now in a general store, he could stand there and in would come some pioneer family with adventures of their own to tell, or he would tell a story to them, accompanied by an uproarious laugh. A few years ago, Renata and I were able to go to New Salem and to walk through the reconstructed village in the evening. And as past the general store, you could just imagine the door opening, and there would be Lincoln effusively rendering a story of some kind. Now, Abraham Lincoln, from an early age, had some political ambitions. He dreamed of even going to the Illinois legislature, but he knew that he really had no education. He'd read a tremendous amount, but he procured a book called, it was The Columbian Orator, of all things. And in it, in reading the speeches of Socrates and so many others, he just drank it in. He became immersed in the cadence, the elegance of the speech, the way of emphasizing, speaking out of principle. And he eventually got in the legislature, served 4 terms there, went on to study law on his own, was allowed to practice before the bar, and thus began his life as a wandering attorney, spending at least 5 months of the year on the road. This began in the year 1841. And he basically followed a judge. So a judge would show up in a town. People would come with their lawsuits. Defendants would take one lawyer and the plaintiff the other, and Lincoln would take one side. And after a day in court, he and the opposing attorney and the judge would retire to the nearest inn to sit in front of the fire, swapping stories until well on into the evening. And then go upstairs to what may well have been the only bedroom, and sometimes the only bed. The judge might be sleeping in the middle and one attorney on one side, Lincoln on the other side. I guess we call that being in bed with the judge. But for him, it was wonderful because he was just gathering more and more stories, more and more experiences. And this was his life. All of it brought with great humor and imagination. But there was another side of Lincoln's life as well. And to understand this life, we have to remember that Lincoln had many bouts of depression. And I think we can trace it to the endless amounts of tragedy that he experienced. Of course, in his early life, his mother died. His sister, older sister, died giving birth to her first child. He spoke of going to many, many different gravesides where little children were buried out there in the frontier. Life was very fragile. Of course, he lost his first love, Anne Rutledge. Later, he would lose his son, Edward, sitting by his bedside, watching helplessly as he just faded away. And then, not that many years later, 12 years later, in the White House, little Willie, the one bright bit of light that he had in this difficult world of his, passed away. It was a difficult life. When he was 36, he went back to Indiana to his old homestead for the first time, and only time. It was a very, very moving experience for him, filled with nostalgia, many positive things that he remembered, but so much of that poem has to do with tragedy. And I'll just see if we can find a spot in here where he writes in a poem that he sends to a friend, a poem he wrote about that experience. And I'll read the last couple stanzas of the first part of the poem. I hear the loved survivors tell how naught from death could save, till every sound appears a knell and every spot a grave. I range the fields with pensive dread and pace the hollow rooms and feel, companion of the dead, I'm living in the tombs. So this was Lincoln's great challenge, I think, keeping these two parts of his life together, the light and shadow, you might say. The light of the imagination and the stories and the poems on the one side, and this deep sense of tragedy on the other, the buoyant, spirited storytelling, and then the underlying current there within his life. Now we're going to move ahead 20 years to the year 1861. Frederick Douglass had moved some years before with his family to Rochester, New York, and there from the basement of the Zion Church, he had cranked out his newsletter, the North Star, the abolitionist journal. And to nobody's surprise, he had become one of the great voices against slavery in the country. To everyone's surprise, Abraham Lincoln had become president of the United States. So everyone was asking, well, who is this man, this new president? A year before, he'd been almost unknown, but then was his speech in the Cooper Union in New York City. Newspapers began to cover him. He was nominated by the Republican Party. That November, there were 4 candidates running. The vote split 4 ways, and when the dust settled, Abraham Lincoln had won the presidency. But what was he saying? Now, of course, the Southerners saw him as an intolerable choice, and more of them, beginning with South Carolina, began to withdraw from the Union. However much he said, I would not tamper with slavery in the South. Nevertheless, they knew that he had said personally he was against slavery. He thought it was wrong to hold one man in bondage to another and take the fruits of that person's labor. And in their minds, that meant that he was an enemy to their culture. Enemy to their way of life. Most abolitionists, however, saw him as just another in the long line of ambitious, crafty lawyers who found their way into the White House. He may have said things about slavery, but all that would be forgotten once he was there. So for the Southerners, he was a radical. For the Republicans, he was a moderate. And in his inaugural address, he spoke eloquently about the need to maintain our bonds of affection, to maintain the Union. He called forth those mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and every patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, which will yet swell the chorus of the Union when touched as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. He's speaking to the country, he's speaking to the South. Stay in the Union. And yet, it did not work, and war began. 11 states break away. 5 slaveholding states stay in the Union, going from Delaware across to Maryland and over towards to Missouri. And so we ask, well, did the Civil War begin because Northerners finally decided to take up arms to eliminate this moral scourge? Well, of course not. That didn't happen. In fact, so desperate was Congress to hold the country together that they actually passed an amendment called the Corwin Amendment. It would have been the 13th Amendment that would have guaranteed the right to hold slaves basically forever. It was a desperate attempt to bring the South back in. It didn't work. The South had already left. They said it's too late. There weren't enough states to pass it. So the war began. But just consider this. In 1861, people saw several possible endings to the war. The North could win a quick victory. The South might win enough quick victories for the North to just say, well, this war isn't worth it, and give them independence. Or there could have been a long, long slog and ended in some kind of compromise. What most everybody believed was that regardless of these 3 possibilities, slavery would have remained. If there were a compromise on the table, the first thing to go would be removing of slavery. So the fact of the disappearance of slavery in just 4 years, when even most abolitionists thought it would take decades, is one of the great stories in history. And so that brings us back to these 2 people, Abraham Lincoln, the wartime president, and Frederick Douglass, who, almost alone of the abolitionists, actually had a great deal of hope for Abraham Lincoln when he came in. But Lincoln made it clear from the beginning that it was union that was his cause. He would uphold the Constitution and the laws of Congress, including the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which said that if a slave escaped to the North, that even the forces of the federal government could be called upon to bring them back. But it wasn't long before even members of his own military were moving more rapidly. As the Northern Army pushed their way into a section of Virginia, 3 slaves came into the Union lines, beyond the Union lines, saying that they had been made to dig fortifications for the rebel army. And so they stayed. A few days later, their master came to find them, demanded to have them back, spoke with General Butler, who said, but they've been working for you. Yeah, he says, but there's the Fugitive Slave Act. But he said, but yes, but you've withdrawn from the Union, so how can you ask us to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act? And so they stayed. And other slaves began to come behind his Union lines. Now this got out, and it went down the slave grapevine. And by August of 1861, over 1,000 men, women, and children had found their way behind the Union lines. Congress then passed a Confiscation Act saying that any enslaved people who had been working for the rebel cause who get to Union lines would be able to stay behind them and become free. Now, down in Missouri, General John C. Fremont had his hands full with open rebellion. It was supposed to be still within the Union, and yet there were many, many disloyal people. And finally he said, well, if this violence continues, anyone who is found to be disloyal to the Union will have his slaves taken from him and made free. Well, this word just electrified the North. I mean, there were torchlight parades among anti-slavery supporters. Harriet Beecher Stowe said, finally the hour has come and the man. But just 12 days later, Abraham Lincoln countermanded the order and said, I have my hands full with these 11 states who have withdrawn. Just have to now deal with what would become an open rebellion if I did such a thing in Missouri. Well, I can't deal with that now. General Fremont was very upset. He said, it's wrong for the country to endure such a great war while ignoring the plight of the slaves. This needed to become a war on behalf of freedom, he said. But Lincoln said no. Well, Frederick Douglass had supported him, but up until then, but now he began to speak out forcefully. He went first to the Cooper Union in February of 1862, almost 2 years to the day after Abraham Lincoln had been there. And he said Freeman is a determined warrior standing up for the immorality of slaveholding, while Lincoln is just another crafty lawyer. Frederick Douglass, over the next weeks, traveled over 1,000 miles to give talks and to meet people in train stations and in restaurants. He spoke in halls. And he said, the people are all ready to sweep slavery from the country, but Lincoln's actions have been calculated to shield and protect slavery. There's a wonderful description of him standing in an open area surrounded by pine trees, standing and speaking to people, wearing a blue suit that just mirrors the blue of the sky above. And he says, the destiny of the African American is the destiny of America. The nation is like an open book, its black inks giving meaning to the white pages and offering lessons about wisdom, power, and goodness, and the sacredness of human brotherhood. Well, what was Lincoln doing during these months? Well, one thing, he was trying to convince the border states to give up their slaves gradually with compensation from the federal government. This was a time when he wrote to a response to Horace Greeley, the New York Tribune, and who was encouraging him to free slaves. He says, well, if I could free all the slaves and preserve the Union, I would do so. If I could free no slaves and preserve the Union, if I would do so. If I could free some and not others, I would do so. But my job here is to work to preserve the Union and to uphold the Constitution. He then invited some black leaders to the White House and spoke to them and said, now Frederick Douglass was not there, but he said to them, now I believe slavery to be the greatest of wrongs, and I hope that I can do something to work against it. But the fact is that the white people in this country do not appear to be willing to live side by side with your people or to give them all the rights that is their due. Wouldn't it be better if you simply took your people to another land and started afresh? We could help you with that. Well, there's no response, a written response of what those black leaders said, but William Lloyd Garrison didn't wait. He said, you might as well attempt to roll Niagara to its source or to cast the Allegheny Mountains into the sea as to think or enticing them out of the country. How pathetic that a nation that proudly boasts of being the refuge of the oppressed of all nations should consider exiling the entire colored population to a distant shore. Frederick Douglass echoed this and spoke of the powerful role that Black Americans have played in this country for those 240 years, that Lincoln fails to see us in our true humanity. He doesn't look at us as his children, but as his stepchildren. And so, we could ask, was Abraham Lincoln out of step with the North? It's very clear that he wasn't. He's very much speaking in line with what the vast majority of people would have felt, and in certain ways was at least a little bit in front of them. But it certainly appeared that emancipation was a long way off. However, already on July 22nd of that year, at a cabinet meeting, he had opened a drawer and taken out a document of emancipation. And they had told him that issuing anything like this would look very desperate since we're losing battle after battle. Put it back in the drawer. But then, after the Battle of Antietam and the victory, on September 22nd, he took it out of the drawer and announced to the American public that on January 1st, 3 months hence, any state that continued to be under rebellion shall be considered to have all of its slaves forever free. Wow. Well, many abolitionists didn't think it was that big of a deal. In fact, there are many people today that still say, well, it was more of a wartime measure than anything else. But Frederick Douglass surprised his fellow abolitionists by saying it was a supremely significant deed. Until then, he said, Lincoln had almost broken my heart with his slothful deliberation, plunging me into the depths of despair. But like Job being restored, my hopes for the nation are suddenly renewed. We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree. And he said, January 1st from now on will become another day in our history, such as the 4th of July. As New Year's Eve approached, Frederick Douglass traveled to Boston and stood in the music hall with William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and many others. When they saw up in the balcony Harriet Beecher Stowe, everybody stood and cheered. And then they waited hour after hour, and when midnight came, the bell tolled. A black minister intoned the words, "Sound the loud timbrel of Egypt's dark sea. Jehovah hath triumphed. His people are free." In Washington that night, crowds of people were out all night long, torchlight parades. And the next day, hundreds and hundreds of people filed past the president, shaking his hand until he said, well, I hope that by the time I sign the proclamation that my hand won't be shaking, because I have never in my life felt so certain. When the document was printed, Frederick Douglass went right to it, scoured the document to find those words, "forever free, forever free." And in fact, some members of the cabinet of Lincoln had said, well, maybe we should just take that word out because, it doesn't give us much wiggle room if we ever have to compromise. But he refused. Lincoln then made the announcement that from this point on, black men would be allowed to wear the Union blue. The Massachusetts legislature established the 54th Black Regiment, and among the recruiters was Frederick Douglass, who worked tirelessly to encourage black men put on the Union uniform. And in fact, on July 18th, just 2 weeks after Gettysburg, the 54th took part in the Battle of Fort Wagner, in which they fought incredibly valiantly. 252 casualties were taken, and one of the injured was the son of Frederick Douglass. Soon, however, Lincoln was again the subject of criticism. Douglass and others were upset that black soldiers were getting paid less than white soldiers. The Confederacy had announced that they would execute any black soldiers that tried to surrender, and they were upset that Lincoln wasn't taking strong action. And finally, Douglas stopped his recruiting and said, "My faith in Lincoln as a man of action rather than words is now nearly gone." So, in early August 1863, Frederick Douglass decided to go see the president. He boarded a train in Rochester and began the long, tedious train journey. Trains weren't comfortable in those days. He would try to go to the sleeping compartment, and it was just a couple of planks. There was soot everywhere coming in. And he said that by the time he eventually got to Baltimore, I was the only one who stepped off that train whose complexion had not been noticeably darkened. Now, he had to walk from one train station to another in Baltimore, so he was back in some of the same streets he had known as a young man, and actually it was somewhat dangerous because it was known that free blacks could even be snapped up and sent down to the South, even in those days. But he did get aboard the train, and he did get to Washington, D.C., and when he got off the train, he stepped into the midst of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of slaves who had found their way to freedom in Washington. Many of them dressed in rags, very emaciated, and here he was walking through their midst, this tall, elegantly dressed man, this black coat and his white collar up to his neck, and his great head of hair that was now beginning to be flecked with gray. He went to a boarding house, and the next morning he decided, I'll go to the White House early because I have no letter of introduction, I have no invitation. So, but if I get there early enough, I can get my card in and have some hope of seeing him. But when he got there, it was already packed with people, even up the staircases. And he sat down for what he thought was a long wait. Well, Lincoln wasn't staying in the White House. He was coming from the soldiers' home because it was another hot, muggy night. So he rode up eventually behind a whole host of cavalry with their swords held high. Lincoln got down, went around the back way, and Douglas settled in, knowing that there had been people there who had been there for days. Shortly thereafter, a voice called out, "Mr. Douglas, the president will see you." You can imagine the look on the faces of these others, all white men, as he walked up the stairs and went into the office of the president. As the door opened, he looked in and he could see Lincoln sitting there amidst papers and books all over, his feet up on chairs. He says, as I walked in, the president stood up, pulled his legs back from whatever part of the room they had wandered in, and strided towards him, saying, "Mr. Douglas, how good of you to come and see me. I know of you. I have read of you. Please, let us have a conversation." And so they do. And they go through the various things, and Abraham Lincoln explains why the issue with pay is difficult. It's because there's so many people opposed at all to having blacks in the military. It is taking a little time. And they talked. Later, Frederick Douglass, after he left, said, I hadn't really convinced him of everything I'd hoped to bring. But, he said, I have never seen a more transparent countenance. There is no racism in that man. There's none of those awkward moments that I even have sometimes with my abolitionist friends. I was never reminded of my humble origin or my unpopular skin color. Well, a year went by, and Frederick Douglass was again upset. This is now August of 1864, and while Abraham Lincoln had come out in favor of an amendment that would abolish slavery, nevertheless, his policies on Reconstruction were destined, he felt, to allow the slave to the South to reassert themselves over blacks, and also Lincoln hadn't come out openly on behalf of blacks' right to vote or total equal rights. And finally he had written, Lincoln is indifferent to slavery and absent of any moral feeling. Well, Lincoln read his words and did what any president should be expected to do. He invited him to the White House. So Frederick Douglass again boarded the train and headed there. This time he was invited in quickly, but he had to wait in the adjoining room for a moment. And as he sat there, he said, I suddenly felt the stare that I know so well. And I looked across, there was Judge Mills of Wisconsin, who says, so you are the president now? And he responded, no, I am Frederick Douglass. Well, Douglass then was invited in, and he sat with Lincoln and looked at a man whose features had so dramatically changed. The lines in his forehead, the hollowed cheeks, and he just reflected on what he had endured in this last year. The fact that just weeks before, Jubal Early's Confederate Army had come within 5 miles of the White House. He had almost had to flee. The treasury was empty. There was almost no gold anymore. The money was almost worthless. Lincoln had called for 500,000 soldiers to join, and very few were signing up. The hospitals were filled with wounded. The descriptions of Walt Whitman were finding their way into newspapers across the country. And then there were the dead. So many war dead as Grant slogged his way towards Richmond, that they had to put out extra editions of the newspaper. Lincoln clearly had aged a full decade, maybe two, in just a year. And here was a man that, if the newspapers were correct, was probably going to lose the election. The Democrats were about to nominate probably General McClellan on a plan of peace, a plan of compromise, which could well mean that the Emancipation Proclamation could get compromised away. And Lincoln explained to Douglass he was walking a fine line. He was supporting the amendment to abolish slavery, but as far as a right to vote, as far as all these things with Reconstruction, it was going to take time. And if he pushed them now, he would almost guarantee the Democrats would take the White House, and almost certainly slavery would become reinstituted in the country. In fact, Lincoln pulled a letter out of the drawer and gave it to Douglass, and Douglass read it. His face just fell. Because in it, Lincoln was telling the American people, now, I am in favor of emancipation, but I understand there are many people against it, and I would be willing to put it out to the country to help choose, even perhaps with a vote. Well, Douglass read this letter, and he just begged Lincoln to put it back in the drawer and never open it again, and that's, in fact, what happened. But then they sat down to talk. Now, they spoke for 2 hours. A couple times an aide came and said, Mr. President, the governor of Connecticut is waiting. He said, well, we'll just tell him to wait. And he came back, no, just tell him to wait. Lincoln said, well, how could we proceed with this? Could you help me, for instance? Could you get the word out to slaves across the South that if they would just leave their plantations and run to Union lines, it would do an enormous amount. It would undercut the Southern effort, and it would also make it impossible to reestablish slavery, however this war ends. And Frederick Douglass said, well, I will think about it. I will do this. And he went home to work on it. 2 weeks later, he had it done. Was sending it to the Washington. General McClellan had, in fact, been the nominee of the Democratic Party. But Abraham Lincoln never had to invoke the plan, because just a few days later, General Sherman marched into Atlanta and then began his march to the sea. And people in the North said, well, it looks as if this war is going to end soon. So they reelected Lincoln. In fact, the war continued. And by March, it was very clear that it was just about over. So Frederick Douglass once again decided to go to Washington, this time to be present for the second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. When Frederick Douglass reached Washington, D.C., it was clear that it was a very different place. The mood was much more upbeat. By this time, there were over 200,000 African American men in the blue Union uniform. And in fact, there were wonderful pictures appearing in the press of the before and after images, and also some lovely stories of black soldiers as they moved into the South, into areas that they had grown up in. In fact, one lovely story of such a soldier who came back onto the same plantation and saw his mistress come out and say, "Well, why are you fighting us?" And he said, "But I'm not fighting you. I'm fighting for freedom." Also, this was the time when the 13th Amendment had been passed by Congress and had already gone out to the states. And when Frederick Douglass arrived, he was invited to stay with Mr. Salmon Chase, who had been governor of Ohio, had been a candidate for president who lost to Lincoln and then served as his Secretary of Treasury, and was now about to replace Roger Taney as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And the afternoon before the inauguration, he and Douglass had tea together. At the conclusion of their tea, Mr. Chase asked if he would come into his bedchamber and help him put on the new robe that he was supposed to wear for his swearing in. And I think it's such a lovely picture of Frederick Douglass standing there with him. I often think of it when I present to the students that day 104 years later when Thurgood Marshall became the first African American Supreme Court Justice. Now, the next day at the inaugural, Frederick Douglass decided to be there very early, and in fact he stood quite close to the front. And when the president came in, followed by the Congress and members of government, he was then able, he said, to hear every word. Right to the end of that famous speech, when he said those words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Now, at the conclusion of the inauguration, everybody started to file over to the White House, and Frederick Douglass went along. As he approached the East Room, he could see Lincoln standing there, he said, like a tall, noble pine, a head taller than the others. Well, Frederick Douglass approached the door, and as he did so, he was yanked back by two burly Washington policemen who said, "No, none of your color are going to be here." And so he looked around, saw another door, went to that door, and exactly the same thing happened. Two men pulled him away. Well, he called out to someone walking in and said, "Tell the president that Mr. Douglass is here." It was just moments later, that tall man was striding through the crowd, stretching out his hand to him, saying, "Here comes my friend, Mr. Douglass. I was glad to see you in the crowd today, listening to my address. Tell me, how did you find it? There is no one whose opinion in this country I more value than yours." And Frederick Douglass looked at him and said, "Mr. President, it was a sacred effort." Well, as we know, within a month, the war was ending, and Abraham Lincoln was struck down by an assassin's bullet. And so, with one last tragedy, the Great War ended. And yet we're still left with the question, how did it happen that in just these 4 years, the massive edifice of slavery, so entrenched in this country, just came crashing down? It required more than deeds of the president, more than an act of Congress. It really required a shift of consciousness. And to understand this, I think we have to turn back again to the work done by Frederick Douglass and his fellow abolitionists over 3 decades. And we certainly have to look to the inner journey that Abraham Lincoln went during these years, moving from preserving the Union to a proclamation of emancipation, and then to that statement in the second inaugural, that the war had, after all, a higher purpose, and that there was a hand of God, a hand of the divine in this entire struggle, which we perhaps had never seen, but now at the end stands so clear. And we can recall, to help us in this process, what Abraham Lincoln wrote to Congress back in his annual message on December 1st, 1862, just 1 month before the Emancipation Proclamation was to take effect, when he said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." Now, this is a mighty change from the words he had been speaking just months before. Preserving the Union, well, that wasn't a cause that requires us to really disenthrall ourselves. It doesn't require us to think or to act anew. But true emancipation, now that was asking something of us that was really quite unprecedented. And so he went on and explained it a bit further. "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the last generation. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." And then 10 months later, we join Lincoln with 10,000 people walking up the incline to the new cemetery, the new military cemetery. And as he went onto that podium, he could look out and see that place where 8,000 men had died and where there were still scars on the battlefield. And then comes that short, simple speech, which builds gradually to really a new vision of what that war was meaning. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this country, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And yet, as we have seen, in the summer of 1864, the nation still seemed to be ready to jettison the president, to compromise away emancipation. But something happened in the final months of that war. One side of it, I think, is that so many of Lincoln's speeches and writings found their way into newspapers. They became read widely. They were learned in classrooms, and children then brought them home and recited them to their parents. That a nation conceived in liberty was having a new birth of freedom. And we can't forget the letters that he wrote. Many of these letters began to appear. Just consider the one, for example, with Fanny McCulloch, who had lost her father in battle. "Dear Fanny," he wrote, "it is with deep grief that I learn of the death of your kind and brave father. In this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to us all. And to the young it comes with bitterest agony, because it takes them unawares. You cannot now realize that you will ever feel better. Is this not so? And yet it is a mistake. You are sure to be happy again. The memory of your dear father, instead of an agony, will yet be a sad, sweet feeling in your heart, of a purer and holier sort than you have ever known before. Your sincere friend, Abraham Lincoln. And then there were the photographs of Lincoln that showed to the nation just how deeply he had borne the tragedy of this really horrendous war, along with his own personal tragedies. I think it began to be a sense among the American people that he'd somehow suffered along with them, that he knew the dark days of the war and the dark days within his own life. And then, of course, there's the second inaugural that you can read inside the Lincoln Memorial. I'll just recite a few words. The Almighty has his own purposes. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills it, that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So this is the journey of Abraham Lincoln, and a journey that I think he had to undergo in order to help bring the nation as a whole along with him, to move beyond acceptance of slavery to the tolerance of slavery, to fully accepting in the depths of their being that slavery was an abomination that had to be removed forever. Now some people criticize Lincoln that he was too slow in this, but Frederick Douglass said a decade later when he spoke at the unveiling of the Freedmen's Memorial in Washington, he said, yes, Lincoln had put the Union first, rather than the plight of the slave. But had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, he would have alienated most people in the North and rendered resistance to rebellion impossible. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. And so I hope that we have taken at least a small step towards appreciating just what kind of change was necessary in this country to bring about the end of slavery. I believe it represents a shift of consciousness during those 4 years, a shift of consciousness that may still have a ways to go today, 160 years later. But a shift of consciousness that, of course, required many people and many cross currents of events to make that change possible. But I would like to conclude by probing a little more deeply into what may have been at work in the transformation going on within President Lincoln himself. And for help, I would like to turn one more time to Rudolf Steiner. We heard of his lectures in October of 1917. And then a year later, after many months in Berlin, he was back once more in Switzerland. The war was ending, but there was tremendous upheaval. At the end of October, when he began his lectures From Symptom to Reality, Germany was teetering on revolution that would sweep away the empire and the Kaiser. There would be a communist takeover in Bavaria, yes, in Munich. Over in the new Soviet Union, the Red Terror had begun, which would bring such sadness to so many people, particularly in the Ukraine, which had been whiplashed for years by armies of Russians and Germans and Poles and their own military. And those were also the days of enthusiasm for Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which, to the dismay of Rudolf Steiner, led to the breakup of Central Europe into so many small nations rooted in blood ties. They were profoundly unsettling times, and people were coming up with all kinds of plans to how to move forward. But in those days in October, Rudolf Steiner was probing into the core question: how can humanity itself move forward? What has to happen before any of these plans would have a hope of coming to fruition? And on the 25th of October, he spoke these words: "Only a genuine concern of each human being for his neighbor can bring salvation to mankind in the future. And only that can bring about true community life." Now, this requires, in my words, a sort of a training ground, and Rudolf Steiner provides one in the tragic element in life. He says here that if one can go deeply into one's own encounters with sickness, with death, with mental disturbance, it can allow a true sympathetic understanding for others to arise. And I think of the sickness and death, I think of Abraham Lincoln as being haunted throughout his life by tragedy. And how so many people spoke of his ability, especially towards the end of the war, to engage so openly and freely with the people who came towards him. But I think also that Rudolf Steiner said not only was there sickness and death, but also mental disturbance. Now, when Abraham Lincoln was an adolescent, there was a young man named Matthew Gentry who was 3 years older than he, which for all purposes was a very lively, outgoing young man, but then at the age of 19 began to slip into insanity. Lincoln would walk over to the farm and stand there listening for hours as this poor young man uttered his moans and his cries. And he thought deeply about this. Now, earlier I mentioned the poem that he wrote when he went back to Indiana. And at the age of 36, when he was there, right away he went to this farm, only to discover that poor Matthew Gentry, now an older man, had slipped fully into a silent madness. So there's a second half to his poem, and that concludes, that it deals with, very poignantly, very painfully, with the case of Matthew Gentry. And at the conclusion of this, he writes, "O death, thou awe-inspiring prince, that keeps the world in fear, why dost thou tear more blessed ones hence and leave him lingering here?" Sickness, death, mental disturbance, the tragic element in life. And of course, this was at work not only in Lincoln, but in so many who endured that terrible war, perhaps leading to a greater respect for one's fellow humanity that could have been the underpinnings for an ending of slavery. Now, on the following day, October 26th, Rudolf Steiner took the theme a step further. In the epic of the consciousness soul, he said, mankind must develop the ability to comprehend the other human being symbolically. That is to say, we must look beyond the mere countenance of the person to the supersensible reality behind, to the spiritual archetype of one's fellow human being. And again, there is a training ground for this. And he says that if we become absorbed in the forms of art, of painting, of sculpture, or in the inner rhythms of music, of poetry, and I might think here also of storytelling, thinking back to the endless stream of stories that arose within Lincoln and took form in his imagination and flowed back out in their own particular rhythm, their own cadence. And here I think of Frederick Douglass, who spoke of the transparent countenance of Lincoln, his ability to put everybody at ease, or I might think that to make people feel that their being is flowing into his being. And so we come to the end of the story. We ranged back to 1917, where Rudolf Steiner first spoke of the victory of Michael in 1879, that sets a new direction for humanity, that leads us beyond those ties of blood, those ties of tribe and nation. They must give way so that we can form communities based on spiritually inspired ideas. And we turned, as Rudolf Steiner suggested, to those 38 years before 1879, considering a series of events that we might truly believe bore some relationship to what was happening in the heavens above. And then finally, we went back to October of 1918 to encounter what Rudolf Steiner said about how we are to move forward. If humanity can in fact build communities for the future, how we must build bridges of genuine concern of one human being for the other, on the one hand, and to perceive the spiritual archetype of one's fellow human being on the other. And perhaps we could see these as well springs for community of the future, but such communities based on spiritually inspired ideas. And so I find it fascinating that the very next night, on October 27, 1918, Rudolf Steiner announced the new edition of the Philosophy of Freedom. And he encouraged members to really take it up. The present epoch, he tells us, is lacking in precisely what the philosophy of freedom seeks to achieve: an ethical individualism rooted in the intuitions of the single individual. And perhaps we can see in this the well springs of community life. Concern for one's neighbor, arising out of the tragic element of life, out of the will. Perceiving the spiritual archetype, arising out of the artistic element of life, out of the feeling element, the rhythmical element. And intuitions arising within the soul of the free spirit, a living thinking, spiritually inspired ideas. Or to put it in Abraham Lincoln's words, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise to the occasion. As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. Thank you.